Perfect. So I'm talking about MicroFrontends past, the present, and the future. So it's a really big topic, and I tried to bring up all good examples which I've seen in the past. But I would also like to give a little bit of context, because I'm not sure if everybody knows MicroFrontends and what it is for and why it is. And I usually tell stories in a way how I have seen them. And basically, my first touch point with MicroFrontends was really early. I think the term MicroFrontends didn't really exist back then. But first things first, yeah, my name is David. I already introduced myself, so I will skip this part, as we anyway have limited time. And I would like to tell you this story in 2016. I just looked up the emails on February 29th, 2016. Basically, a friend of mine asked me to help in a project, and 2016, that was nearly a decade ago in the JavaScript world, and we had a brownfield project. So brownfield means that you have stuff there already and that you need to migrate it. And what we did, I'm not sure if you still know this framework, we moved from Backbone.js with 160 views and 240 models. It's kind of a big application, to AngularJS. Yeah, so nothing to do with React yet, but basically same problem. We had to migrate the framework, and basically we had a lot of people sitting in this team. And beside this, these people were also split up into two locations. So one was sitting in Vienna and another team was sitting in Bratislava. And, if you have two teams, or if the team is getting too big, you kind of need to find ways to modularize your software and to modularize your front end. And basically that's what we did back then. So we kind of understood, okay, we need to split this up. We have a banking domain, so we have a transaction overview where you can see what is my current payment, what is my current balance, and then you can jump to a different application which does your payments, or where you, for example, can lock your cards and so on, right? And well, we didn't know the term MicroFrontends as mentioned. We just, built 3 applications and linked them together with hyperlinks. And basically, a few years later, then the concept of MicroFrontends was born, and we found out, hey, we basically did kind of MicroFrontends because we had separate applications, and altogether, it was one big online banking platform, right? And then we had this issue, and now it's getting a little bit more interesting, that we have, service components somewhere. So as we've seen with web components, back then there unfortunately were no web components, where the request that, if you were on a transaction overview, you still wanted to chat with a bank clerk, or if you did a payment and it didn't work, you still wanted to chat with a web clerk. But this basically was self-service functionality. So we needed to move this, or we needed to provide this functionality to the self-service team, right? But implemented or available on the transaction payment creation overview, right? And this brings me to the first really interesting thing, which is a kind of super old thing, which is introduced by PayPal back then, and I think you can still remember those PayPal buttons everywhere. And basically what they did is they introduced a framework called Zoid. I'm sure you don't know it anymore. I think it's also not really maintained anymore. Oh, it is 16 hours ago. But what they did basically is they introduced a framework to exactly get web components before web components existed. And what does this look like? So basically, I'm here on the wrong one. Basically, that's Zoid. That's a Zoid component, or a Zoid application we could think of. And, it looks really end-to-end. Yeah, we have all the script tags and so on and so on. And what we did is, what you could do with Zoid is you, of course, need to include it. And then you could include components. So these were really called components back then. So Zoid components. And Zoid components always consisted of 2 things, CSS and HTML. And the JavaScript, of course, right? And when we introduce the Zoid now, this Zoid component, which is kind of compiled then into our application, then we just say basically we want to have a new Zoid component, right? So a MyLogin Zoid component, and this consists of a few attributes. So we can give it a pre-filled email address, and we can give it a callback function basically when somebody clicks on login, right? So basically that's what you do here. You say, hey, create a component, give it a tag, so it really looks similar like web component, and on callback do something. basically, or provided as in RayTraf. And that's what we did here. So we introduced a thread component, and we basically give it a way where it can write back to us, and we render it into a container diff. So how does this look like? If we open the browser and check this out, then we see this is basically MicroFrontends with iframes. So we have this login component here. If I click test, then basically what I see is that this iframe here is rendered in the container. And beyond this, if I click on login, this will change and basically shows me then a result container, which then is pre-filled by the iframe, so to say. So we get the information from the component out to the root application again. And was one of the first things which we did back then. So we really used Zoid for reusable components. And this was, so to say, the first generation of MicroFrontends. Yeah? And then when you did this, we moved into this direction. So basically we built MicroFrontends in 2016 with hyperlinks. And for example, Amazon is big on building MicroFrontends with hyperlinks. So if you ever went to Amazon, and if you, for example, check out a new product, yeah, if you buy a book, this is JavaScript, the good parts. And if you then go to the invoice or to the buying process, basically if you click there, this will open a new tab, and this tab will look completely different than the whole Amazon application looks, right? And what they did is basically they did the same thing, right? They split up the application in smaller chunks by introducing hyperlinks, and that the pages looks totally different, but it doesn't really matter because they were independent. They can be deployed and built by independent teams. And basically for them, this makes a huge change because they can at a faster pace develop these different parts of the application, right? So in 2016, we had iframes and hyperlinks for building MicroFrontends. And this talk is called The Past, the Present, and the Future of MicroFrontends. I guess you already know this is kind of the past, right? And if we moved on, we actually realized that 50% of the internet traffic back then in 2017, I think 17, 16, somewhere there was a tipping point where we moved up to 50% of internet traffic by mobile phones. And iframes had this big issue of not really being responsive. And also this problem that if you do all the afterloading with iframe, it takes a lot of traffic, right? And so people moved more and more to the server side. And what we introduced then in the MicroFrontend world is something what we called server-side integration. And basically this works kind of similar, but instead of having these iframes there, we wanted to have this self-service microservice, and this self-serving microservice should actually provide this content to the payment creation, not by an iframe, but in a very similar way. So for example, if you load the application, you go to Edge service, then you have this payment creation and the self-service microservice. And basically, they give you back this payment creation fragment. And this payment creation should contain the self-service fragment, right? So all this composition should not happen on iframe on the client side anymore, but should happen on the server side, yeah? And this is usually done by server-side includes. So IKEA, for example, uses them a lot. And what this basically does is it's really just on the Edge server. Can it be Nginx? Can be whatever it is, basically. They also port the server-side includes, integrate different MicroFrontends into one application, yeah? And there was Project Mosaic from Zalando and Taylor itself. And a lot of other things were introduced, and a lot of other frameworks. For example, one is Podium, which I would like to show you a little bit more in detail. And it's really simple. Yeah, there's not so much complexity in here. So if we go to Podium, what you basically see here is that you have two portlets. So that's how they call it. So a portlet is basically just a MicroFrontend and a fragment. There are other MicroFrontend frameworks on the server side called these fragments. And what it basically does, it's really just a router, a meta router on the server side. So for example, if somebody hits this request here, it basically says, hey, give me portlet A and give me portlet B, right? And bring it all together into one application. And here the portlets are registered. So you need to start all your MicroFrontends as separate applications. And basically here they are then fetched and then they are composed, right? And on the application side of things, that's basically kind of simple. Yeah, if you take a look at this, that's basically here the application now, and we don't even see on the network layer that this is coming from two different routes, right? Because we get it back from localhost, right? And this local host will already have both portlets in here. Yeah? And that's server-side rendering. So we moved from integrating on the client side with iframes and so on back to the server side and did the integration server side. And Portlet, what I just showed you, was one of multiple frameworks you could use or we used here to get this done. Yeah. And then basically, Taylor's was the most prominent from Zalando, which Open Components and Podium and lots of others, right? But then you have this problem with server-side includes or server-side integration itself, that you have a lot of round trips, right? Whenever you change something, whenever you need to navigate from one side to the other side, you have these round trips, and you don't want to have these round trips, right? That's why we introduced single-page applications to get all the server composition down to the UI side again, right? And on the UI side, it kind of looked very similar. You had an app shell, which is kind of your meta router, and based on the request, we load different templates, and these different templates then basically load different components from a server and render them together, right? So, for example, if you go to the overview, you get the transaction overview and the payment creation. If you go to the create payment, you get different MicroFrontends, but you compose them together during runtime. And one application framework there was, for example, Single SPA, Piral, Luigi, and many more. And Luigi, for example, just to give you really a high-level overview how these things look like, basically it looks very similar to what we've seen before, right? Because it basically does the same thing. It maps MicroFrontends based on the roots, so it composes them, right? And what we do is we do this at runtime now, right? So we do this at server time anymore. We do this on the client side. So we get back basically just a JavaScript application cell. That's what Luigi is, right? So Luigi is basically this part. And based on the root, we load different MicroFrontends and load them into our application and serve them there, right? And Luigi itself is just a router basically. It says, hey, if you go to simple app HTML, hey, give me this kind of different path segments. So if you go to sample 1, you get the sample app sample 1, and if you go to sample 2, you get a different application. Yeah, that doesn't really matter. It's just really the same thing what we did on the server back then on the client side. And this was then the year of web components, right? No, it of course was not the year of web components, but web components had the first big time back then, because people started to realize that if you build MicroFrontends with multiple teams, and that's always the goal, right? Because at some point in time when an application gets too big, and if you have too many people working on it, they're stepping on each other's toes, so you need to split this up, right? And web components were an interesting aspect here, because then you could go polyglot. You could say, hey, the team chooses the technology they want to use, right? I mentioned before that we use a lot of React and Svelte these days, and I don't want to tell somebody who is deeply religious about Svelte or religious about React, hey, use Svelte now because we decided to use Svelte, right? That's not the thing how it should work. So with web components, we have this, this frame where we could easily reuse code or framework independent code into an application. And that's basically an interesting idea, and people understood this and say, hey, when we build such a thing, then let's build it up on web components. And that's what the web component router looks like, for example. That's a very simple thing again. And what they do is basically they provide, based on a path, different web components. So if you go to a path, it will load a web component, and you of course could do things like lazy loading and so on and so forth, all baked into just a really simple router, which is basically a web component router. Yeah? And that's the same thing as Luigi works, with the difference that we can use now whatever framework we want to use, because basically all of them just return a web component. As we've seen, it's super simple to create a web component from React. It's super simple to create a web component from Svelte, right? And yeah, that's the third step, so to say, when we moved back from server-side includes. So many companies moved them down to client-side integration when it comes to MicroFrontends again. And here we stayed for a while, and it looked good. But then we had web components, of course, but then we had this idea of the first meaningful paint. At some point in time, I don't know, 2018, 19, everybody was talking about the first meaningful paint. It went into history as LDD, right? Lighthouse driven development. So everybody was just checking, hey, how fast is my page? How fast is my page, right? And then people realized again, oh no, if we just do the whole rendering on the client side, we have a very bad experience for users, right? And all these pictures about first meaningful paint, what it means, I guess I don't have to explain it anymore. But basically, as we've seen, the first meaningful paint with big frameworks like Angular, for example, right, is very bad. I mean, and it's not even good with React, honestly speaking, right? And that's why we said, okay, no, let's do the hydration. Let's move things again on the server. Let's do server-side rendering like Next.js does, right, or Angular Universal. Or let's even do build-time rendering like Gatsby does. So render the whole stuff at build time, and then progressive enhance it at runtime. And I'm a big fan of progressive enhancement. That's, I think, one of the most important terms these days when it comes to web engineering, because what it basically means, and as usual, MDN has a very good opinion about it, is that you just provide the baseline of data which you need, right? And once the user has loaded this baseline, so basically just HTML and CSS, you plug on JavaScript, right? And that's what we call hydration. So we have this HTML, CSS part, right? And we hydrate it then afterwards with JavaScript. But the user is instantly able to see something, yeah? And that's basically the whole concept behind these frameworks, that we bring this first meaningful paint versus server-side rendering or even build-time rendering very, very fast available. And that's where we have been, right? We had this server-side integration and we had this client-side integration. And people started to build things twice. They did it with server-side integration and they kind of hydrated it with client-side integration. But it really didn't work because we had two different frameworks for getting the same thing done. But for getting the same thing done, one's on the server and one's on the client. And then we needed something which is overlapping, which works on the server side and also works on the client side integration. So which supports hydration, right? Which supports hydrating our MicroFrontend architecture. And this guy here, he is a genius, Zach Jackson. He introduced something which actually enables us doing this, because he introduced module federation in Webpack. And it was a big change. I think it's a fundamental, the most fundamental change in Webpack since its existence. And basically, I guess most of you know a little bit already about Webpack Federation. You know, you have this two parts of your applications. I can quickly show you this. Basically, what the essence, we don't have the time to dig deep into it, but the essence of Webpack is basically that you expose data, right? So you have a client and you have a host, right? And your client, for example, exposes the module, and your host then basically can use this model, and you don't need to, query this during runtime, because Webpack does this for you, right? They create your entry points, and then you can easily fetch this data, right? And that's basically interesting, because the interesting part about it is not how module federation itself works, and you can look this up, all these demos on GitHub afterwards. But the interesting part is basically that this is working not only on the client side, but it's also working on the server side. And Tech itself wrote a fantastic blog article on it. He explained how it works in Next.js, right? That you do it during server-side integration, so that you integrate all your Webpack modules together at server time, and that you also can do this then on client side, right? And it's the same with Gatsby. You can do this with Gatsby. You can even do this with Angular. You can use Webpack module federation with Angular Universe and with Angular on the client side. You can use it with Next on the server side and classical React on the client side, so to say. And that's actually the achievement, because when I first talked about MicroFrontends, that's quite a while ago, in 2018, I had this decision tree, and you have these options, and you can do build-time integration, server-side integration, runtime integration, you can have Hyperlink integration, and basically that's bullshit, because you don't need all these things anymore. You need two things. You need Hyperlink integration, and you need basically module federation. And what you still can use, because it plays very well together with module federation, if you want to go polyglot, you can use web components. And then people say, okay, web components, server-side rendering, not really working. Bullshit, not true anymore. Yeah, there's a lot of movement into this web component area where we say, hey, let's be able to hydrate web components. Let's be able to make them progressive enhanced. And this is, for example, a project which is very interesting on GitHub. If you look for Web Components Ocean, you find a small, tiny library which allows you to compile or to render web components on server side. So basically, we went into a direction where we can use basically very baked in things into our tools and don't need big libraries or frameworks to build module federation, MicroFrontends, sorry. And basically, that's what is important for me to tell you, yeah. So that's me. I think this was basically it. Just one thing. Even if module federations will make MicroFrontends a lot easier, or if they already do, in most initiatives front-end model is still cool enough. Yeah, that's important to mention because I see so many clients just saying, hey, we want to build MicroFrontends. Cool, that's me. Looking forward to your questions.
All right, so let's move to discussion and see what we have. So first, can you share the GitHub repository or the code?
Yeah,
People
I will
really want to try this stuff because it's interesting. It at the same time it's a tiny bit complicated if you've never done MicroFrontends before.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah.
I try to pack it in all so that you at least get understanding why this thing's involved. And if you see all the projects, they use all this old stuff. And these days, the too long don't read of this talk is module federation is the way to go. And maybe implement it with web components if you need multiple frameworks.
So on server side, we have something like microservices as well. So what's the connection? We have MicroFrontends and microservices. Are they connected or separate, or how do you deal with this concept?
Yeah, so I'm big into full verticalized systems. So basically, I like my teams that they deliver end to end, so that they can kind of, let's say, payment, right? In banks, usually payment is a big thing. So you have your payment logic, and those people who build, the connection to the payment provider, so that you can do your payment, should basically also build the UI, right? That's the perfect choice. And if you really have these teams, then maybe there's really a team which says, hey, no, we don't want to do Vue.js, right? And that's fine. And they should do this because they should deliver the front end for their business logic, right? And then at some point in time, you need payment somewhere, and you just need to aggregate it together on an edge server if you do server-side integration. And basically, that's it. Yeah. So if you want to have verticalized systems and verticalized teams, you basically need MicroFrontends, right? Because otherwise, you always have this horizontal layer which builds the UI and needs to talk to all these different teams which build all these different microservices. But basically, you want to have really end-to-end deliverables there. And that's why this all plays together, of course, with microservices on the backend.
So if you have separate teams doing verticals, and one is using Vue and one is React and third is Svelte. So, and then at the same time, there's a lot of push for design systems.
Yeah.
And sort of, is it against, or can you go with design systems even if you do microsystems or these MicroFrontends and
well,
so?
web components are actually the way to solve this, right? So if you build your design system in web components, and Material, for example, there's a web component implementation for Material. So of course there are the React implementations, there's Svelte implementation, but basically there's a Material web component application directly from the Material team. So those people who are really doing the design guide also builds the Material implementation with web components. And I think in the future this will be the way to use Material. And then you can, doesn't really matter, right, if you use it from Vue or React, because everybody supports web component these days. So I'm a little bit with Matthias in this direction. I know it's an old joke, but I think that the year of web components is web components is near. Yeah, not sure if it's already next year, but at some time there will be the year of web components. I'm optimistic. Yeah.
Yeah. So now we have some questions from the audience. So do we need Next.js for SSR with module federation, or can we plug SSR within plain React multiple microfrontends?
Can we plug?
Yeah, I think we have to parse it a little bit. So it's.
I think the question is if we need Next for server-side rendering and or no.
Yeah, I guess the first point is that, I mean, how does it go with Next.js? So you want to do microfrontends, you can do it on top of Next, right?
Yeah, I mean, Next basically provides you the server-side rendering part, right, on top of React. So that's basically what they do, right? They give you the initial response with basically all the stuff in there, and basically then they hydrate with JavaScript the dynamic part of it, right? And this makes it, of course, a lot faster for the first meaningful paint. So basically that's what they do. And of course there are other ways to get server-side rendering done in the React world or in the React ecosystem. It doesn't really matter, right, if you use Next or whatever you want to use for server-side rendering on the React side. The important part is that module federation, if you implement it with module federation, and if you say, hey, Node basically build me this application, or Webpack, sorry, build me this application, right? Or web components or Webpack, sorry, on the client side, compose this application, then it's working on both sides. So they can do it on the server side. So server is able to execute module federation, and also the client side is able to execute module federation. So with module federation, it's up to you where you want to kind of compose these things together. Yeah. That I hope this point is kind of clear. Yeah.
So how do you deal with the versioning of components or these MicroFrontends? So I imagine,
yeah. Well, I'm a big fan of monorepos, so real full-scale monorepos we could call it. So really backend, front-end, all the stuff in one monorepo. Depends a little bit on the organizational culture, I would say, on the code ownership of the organization. But usually I'm not a big fan of versioning all this stuff, packaging all this stuff, making this push and pull down and updating version everywhere, because doesn't make too much sense and makes things a little bit more complex. So monorepos usually solve this issue. Still important that you can independently deploy those different MicroFrontends then. Yeah.
So speaking of monorepos, which tooling do you use with yours?
Yeah, we use a lot of NRVL these days. So NRVL is the company, right? NX is the tool. So basically they have good support now for Node.js on the backend side, because full stack these days usually means writing everything in JavaScript, and that's fine. So basically we do lots of things with Next. We of course use Learner, but Learner is actually going a little bit in a different direction, right? Because they support different versions for different modules, and basically we don't really want to do this. We always want to be on the base, on the trunk, and we just with feature toggles then enable things or disable things. So NX is really a cool thing. I know that I'm so bad with names. Turbo Repo. You sure know the creator of it. So there's a new tool coming up called Turbo Repo. Yeah, exactly. And I'm looking forward to this, because I think there's a lot of potential in this monorepos. All big companies are working with them, but most of the tools are unfortunately not open source. And I think that we can improve a lot of things there. NX is a good tool. Yeah, still has kind of the downsides. Yeah. But
we actually have one of the creators of NX on Friday.
Cool.
So it's going to be interesting to continue from this. Then we have more questions. So let's say you have multiple MFE. I guess it's
MicroFrontends. Yeah.
MicroFrontends, yeah, of course. MicroFrontends with React, and you want only one MicroFrontend to have server-side rendering, or few components require server-side rendering. How will a server-side module federations work here? So it sounds like more complicated case.
So if one MicroFrontend needs to be server-side rendered, if I got this correct.
Yeah. I guess you get the different types of configurations. So
okay.
So one out of many MicroFrontends needs server-side rendering, and the rest don't need it.
Well, so if you load the initial page, right, and you want to have one part of this page be server-side rendered, because it should be available on request without any JavaScript interaction needed. I guess that's the question. And the other part is okay if it's loaded afterwards, and if it's not directly available, right? Well, that's basically what I meant before, yeah. So if let's assume you build this with Next. So you build Next.js application, and you have module federation, and you want to directly load on the Next rendering side, so to say, on the server side. You directly want to load one Webpack module federation module, and also want to render it, right? Then you can easily do this during the request, so during the server-side rendering part. And if you don't want to do this for others, if you want to load them then on demand on the client side, for whatever reason, I don't see a good use case for this, but I don't know the use case, then you can still do this, because as I said, that's the core message of this whole module federation part in this talk, that doesn't really matter if you federate your modules for module federation on client side or you do it on server side, because both parts, the server and the client, can do it. Yeah, and so you can mix and match. You can say, okay, no, I don't need it, I need it, or I need it just for a few parts and I don't need it for a few other parts. Yeah? So basically, this shouldn't be a problem. Yeah, of course, the devil lies in the details, and I don't know if I fully got the question, but basically it should work, and module federation should support